everybody? Welcome into Tom Curran's Patriots Talk podcast. Phil Perry alongside, and we got the Patriots on the field yesterday, didn't we, Phil? Got our eyes on them, didn't we?
We did. Peepers peeping at practice. Good times had by all. I always love this time of year.
I do too. We also had Bill Belichick step to the mic and play a little bit of button, who's got the button? That's an old Johnny Most saying from when people were zipping it around, playing button, who's got the button? So that's what they're playing with the play calling duties. Here's Bill in all his glory.
Yeah, look, there's a lot of jobs that we have to do. We're all working on those things now. It's May. They'll change in June, they'll change in August, they'll change in September. So we'll evolve to the things timely that we need to do. And if you're asking about game plans, we're like months away from that. Months.
So I'm going to set the scene. We go out to practice. If you've been to those practice fields, there's two adjacent practice fields. There's a big-ass hill, grassy knoll, that runs probably about 200 yards long. And the media all sits up on the hill. Myself, Phil, Mike Reese, Mike Giardi, and Mark Capello, Sports Hub, all went down past the bleachers, where the bleachers are usually where we sit. They were deconstructed. And the rest of the media was down the other end. So we weren't sharing notes necessarily, but it was kind of a me, Reese, Phil observing and conversing. Phil, what did we see? What did we see out there?
Well, what people want to know is what we saw from the coaching staff, right? So when it came to the coaching staff early in the practice, if you've been to a Patriots practice before during training camp, it's pretty similar where they do a lot of drills early on. It's all fundamental stuff early on. And if you were watching Mac Jones and the quarterbacks, you saw Joe Judge with that group throughout. You also saw Joe Judge at times not only coaching the quarterbacks, but also speaking to the wide receivers and the tight ends at times when they were going over some different routes and the quarterbacks were actually throwing to their teammates. So Joe Judge looked like the guy running that portion of the practice. However, overseeing the entire thing, and I think saying a little less, but chiming in at times, was Bill Belichick. So he was there with that group for, I would say, it's almost the entire first half of practice this time of year is that sort of stuff. So that was the early part of practice, Tom. But then once they got together for 11-on-11s, it got shaken up a little bit in terms of whose voice was maybe the most important.
Right. Matt Patricia, who had been on a backfield where the offensive line always works out. He had been working with the offensive line. They came in. And then Matt Patricia, this was the interesting tweak because we're sitting there going, wow, kind of looks like Judge here. And then Patricia comes in and really is the one who's working with Mac Jones. Now, when we look at the context of what was probably going on, all the work that Troy Brown and Joe Judge are doing with the quarterbacks and receivers was being highlighted, taking meeting room time and practice room time or meeting room time onto the field. So Mac Jones was just executing what those specific coaches wanted. And then Matt Patricia was saying, okay, run this toss, run this dive, run this whatever, stretch play, so that our offensive line knows what they're doing. So Matt Patricia then became the voice. That was during 11-on-11. Again, no contact, no touchy, shirts and T-shirts, shorts and shorts. Levels of undress. But Phil, this was interesting because, again, Bill Belichick's undivided attention was basically with the offense. And then at the end, Bill took over for the 11-on-11 stuff.
Yeah, it looked like he was the one sort of reading off of something, whether it was a play or he was just giving Mac Jones notes. We don't know what he's holding, but you could see in between plays of the last couple 11-on-11 periods, Bill Belichick would look down at something. He would say something to Mac Jones. Mac Jones would then go into the offensive huddle, call a play, and they would run a play. So it looked like Bill Belichick's show for the last couple 11-on-11 periods, I would say. During those periods, though, Matt Patricia wasn't far from Bill Belichick, and Joe Judge was essentially right behind where the quarterback would be when he had made his drop. So he's probably standing 10 yards behind the center, or maybe even a little bit more during those periods. And so, yeah, I just thought it was interesting. Once they got together for that first 11-on-11 period, it did look like it was almost maybe a little bit more run game focused. Tom, that was something that Reese pointed out, and looking back at some of my notes, that that appears to be the case, that, when the offensive line coach comes over and he looks like he's kind of running the show, it's the run game stuff, which makes some sense. The way I wrote it, Tom, after the fact was, if you were explaining what went on at practice on Monday to any football fan, you would say, well, it kind of looked like, knowing that we don't have titles for Joe Judge or Matt Patricia that actually describe what they do. So if you were to describe it to someone, you would say, well, it sort of looked like Joe Judge was serving as a passing game coordinator and quarterbacks coach. Matt Patricia sort of looked like an offensive line coach and a run game coordinator, since he looked to be in charge during that 1-11-on-11 period. And then Bill Belichick, by the end of it, Tom, sort of looked like the offensive coordinator. I mean, he was the one kind of putting it all together in what were, they looked like relatively competitive 11-on-11 periods. It looked like he was the guy running the show. That's to me the best way to describe it.
Doesn't that make more sense than any of the iterations that we have kind of thought might be coming to pass, whether it be play caller offensive coordinator Joe Judge or play caller offensive coordinator Matt Patricia? I mean, when you have one of the best coaches in the league depart after nearly 20 seasons and all the success that Josh McDaniels had, the only way to replace him is really with a guy who knows as much as he does about the personnel, about everything that goes into offensive football. And Michael Hawley and I crossed swords about whether or not Bill Belichick could be offensive coordinator a couple months ago. I said, I think he can be. And Hawley scoffed at that notion, saying that I don't think that he could be offensive coordinator. Maybe the three brains together are designed to replace Patricia. Does that make you feel better if you're a Patriots fan than you felt on
Josh McDaniels? Replace Josh McDaniels?
What did I say, Patricia?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's not what I'm talking about. McDaniels, thank you. Did you feel better as a Patriots fan / observer who wants to see the team do better and have a nice product to observe all year, Phil?
To me, there's no question this makes the most sense if this is the way it plays out. With Bill Belichick being that voice in Mac Jones's ear, we know even when Tom Brady was here, Bill Belichick would meet with Tom Brady on a weekly basis. They spent a lot of time together. They would go over game plans. They would figure things out. To me, that would make sense, would be to have not only your most experienced coach and your most experienced coach within the offense and coaching offense for this team, even though, it may not have been his quote unquote specialty. He was certainly doing it, and has been for 20 years. Not only that, Tom, but probably also, I would say, your most poised voice on the coaching staff in your quarterback's ear.
Yes.
On game day, when it
matters. Which is what we talked about last week. The avalanche of words that Patricia and Judge can sometimes unleash, if it's passing into Bill's ear too, or Bill's having the opportunity to say, Joe, we gotta simplify a little bit for our guy here, then that's a huge help.
I just wonder if that's what we will see once September rolls around. Again, I think that's what makes the most sense. But we did hear a few things yesterday from players, particularly Kendrick Bourne, who made it seem like this might be temporary. Him talking about how you just want to make the most of this time with Bill Belichick, where he's spending more with the offense because everything's new right now, and he just wants to make sure it goes well at this stage. And you want to try to soak up as much as you can because it's not normal to get this much time with Bill Belichick. It just made it seem temporary. And I could see Bill Belichick saying, could I call plays? Yeah, sure, I could. And maybe he's leaving that option open for himself, Tom. But I also could see him saying, my true value is as a real head coach, as somebody who is coaching all sides of the ball and keeping in mind the clock and keeping in mind timeouts and keeping in mind injuries and all of those things that I have to really pay close attention to for 60 minutes. If I'm having my nose in a play sheet, so to speak, I may not be serving the team as best I can.
Right. And I guess that's worth highlighting too. Patriots special teams in 2021 were disappointing. Cam Akers did not have a good year. After the 2020 year, he sends two guys to all-pro status. But last year, it was a litany of block punts, mistakes, just not good. Bill would be a default special teams overseer. Can he do that as well as he would like to if he's with the offense. The defense is pretty well documented, wasn't terrific at the end of the year. That could still use some attention, especially as it transitions its linebacker core and all that institutional knowledge that Jamie Collins and Dante Hightower and Kyle Van Noy had has gone out the door. So I could see why it would be temporary, but also the guys who are going to take it over, Judge and or Patricia, I wonder what level of acumen Bill needs to see from them before he's able to say, okay, you guys take the reins and run stuff with Mac.
That part of it is fascinating to me too. Is this a competition right now? Is there Bill Belichick says every year this time of year, this is not an evaluation period. That's training camp. Training camp is the competition camp. This is a teaching camp. We're just trying to lay the foundation here. But that's for the players. Is he evaluating his coaches right now to see who would be best served to be the guy once training camp does roll around, if it's not going to be Bill Belichick? And he did say something during his press conference alluding to the fact that, yes, by the time training camp hits, we kind of have to be off and running with whatever this process is going to be.
Mm-hmm.
That's essentially what I gleaned from one of his answers on Monday. So I wonder how closely he's watching these guys, how closely he is listening to these guys in the meetings and seeing who's taking charge. I could see him leaning Matt Patricia in one respect, Tom, in that Patricia has at least called plays in an NFL game before on the defensive side, and maybe he feels like that's a skill set that can translate to the offensive side if you are well-versed enough in the offensive playbook. You're used to watching things play out in real time. You're used to making adjustments based on what's happening on the field, based on what the other team is throwing at you. You're just doing it from a defensive perspective.
Right.
Maybe he looks at Patricia and says he's got the lead because he has at least done this, even if it's on the opposite side of the ball.
Yeah, and he's been on the headset during that period of time in a game where it's open and they're communicating back and forth, booth to sideline, the whole crew of them. It's very much a process that's developing, and it also does go back to something we've talked about, and that's the Bill Belichick delegating. It's the age of 70. More and more and more is coming under his umbrella. He's not pushing away from the table on things. He's collecting responsibilities, which is terrific. But when the Patriots were at their best, didn't they have a whole bunch of very talented lieutenants reporting to that one general?
They did. And I would wonder, and we need to get our friend Mary Kay Cabot on the horn, or somebody from Cleveland who covered that Browns team back in the day, because it feels like, Tom, in the 90s when he was running the Browns, he had all kinds of responsibilities the way that he does now. He reportedly had called some offensive plays while he was in Cleveland at some point in time. He was, running the front office. He was the head coach. He was heavily involved with the defense, even though Nick Saban was there. And we know what he thinks of Saban's defensive mind. So I wonder if he wouldn't look back at that experience and say, okay, that was a lot. I don't know. Maybe I can handle more now because I'm so much more experienced and I know what I'm capable of, more fluently than I did 30 years ago. But that to me is an apt sort of comparison potentially. Again, we'd have to talk to somebody who was closer to that Browns team, but it feels like he did a lot then and he's doing a lot now.
All right, let's put a cork in the play calling for now, and let's go with a few other impressions from camp. Mac Jones looking a little thicker around the shoulders. I thought his bucket was a little thicker as well. Same old arm strength, which in these settings is always more than adequate. My concern with the arm strength of Mac Jones, that I think he has exhibited as well by going to see Tom House in the offseason, which he acknowledged, is off-platform throws, being able to whip your body through and create velocity when everything isn't perfect. He's got to get better at that. So, Mac Jones impressions from you yesterday, Phil.
Yeah, I thought he looked, you mentioned where he looked thicker. To me, he just, his face and his gut, and Kendrick Bourne acknowledged this, his stomach is gone. I think it's pretty clear he's worked on himself this offseason. And that's no surprise given everything we know about him and how apparently dedicated he is to his job based
Mhm.
on everything we've heard. So it does not surprise me that, he would have cleaned up his diet. It was interesting to hear him talk about how he might bulk back up in some way uh to be able to withstand hits, because there is a fine line. I mean, this is a guy who, when he got to college, they basically told him he had to gain some weight, and he's talked about this before, but he basically just started crushing cookies. Cookies. That was just, and he put on a bunch of weight, and he ends up, starting for Alabama that year, and has a unbelievable historic sort of college season. So um to be able to maintain the weight but have his body change, I think is the balancing act. And so uh that to me was sort of the individual takeaway from him, not the, it sounds like for those that were keeping stats from practice, he was pretty, you know, he had a great completion percentage.
One would
Nothing
hope.
stood out to me in terms. I mean, yeah, I mean, like he looked accurate. He looked like he had, control of the offense. There was really one moment where they had trouble, or two moments, I guess. They had trouble
Right,
getting
actually.
in and out of a huddle at one point. Then a little bit later, they fumbled a snap. He and Cody Russi, I want to say, is his last name. I apologize to Cody Russi. I have it here in my OTA notes, but they fumbled a snap, and then they had a false start. And Mac Jones, it appeared, seemed to be kind of Cody Russi. Yes, he appeared to be kind of taking responsibility for that false start, and Belichick sent them all for a lap.
As
So
the entire team took a lap.
yeah,
That was me.
Joe Judge
That was
included.
me. That
Joe
was
Judge, all the
me.
offensive coaches. Yeah, that was me.
That was me.
Well, we don't know if that's exactly what he said, Tom, because we're not supposed to quote players on the field. I know that's not what you're doing there.
Stop snitching, Phil. First defense and the cornerbacks. Give me your first impressions on what we saw on the field with that group.
Two impressions.
OTAs. First impression.
You want to do corners first?
Yeah. Who'd you see dancing around out there first?
Malcolm Butler and Terrence Mitchell and Jalen Mills, I would say, were the top three guys. We saw Jack Jones out there quite a bit, the rookie out of Arizona State, 4th-round pick.
A lot of punt return reps for him too.
Yeah, he did a lot of that late. But that's, your corner group. We saw Juwan Williams out there a little bit. But I would say, to me, it looks like they're trying to get Jack Jones up to speed, and good for them. They should. They need as much help as they can get at that position. We did see Marcus Jones, who we just did a podcast on for Next Pats. We did see him on the field, but he did not participate in the team drills. So he was out there and he was doing the conditioning with everybody, and he went through some of the drills, but he did not do the team period stuff. He's still working his way back from shoulder surgeries. So that's sort of what I saw from the cornerback group.
And the linebacker level, there was no Matt Judon there yesterday, but the linebacker level, Phil, anything stand out to you as to who was out there? Cam McGrone spent a lot of time on the field. So did 30, Phil.
Mac Wilson. Yeah, Cam McGrone, when it came to the team stuff, didn't do a whole lot. So I wonder if he's still limited in some capacity, Tom. But he spoke to us after, and it seems like physically he's fine. Maybe it's just, they're trying to get him caught up to speed with some mental reps. But Mac Wilson was out there quite a bit. I would say that the top two guys were Juwan Bentley and Raekwon McMillan. And McMillan's an interesting one to me because he tore his ACL about a year ago. And he told me right after practice, just a couple months ago, he was doing basically nothing laterally. He wasn't doing a whole lot east-west. And now he's out there early taking team critical. It's OTAs, Phil. He's taking, I would say, valuable team reps next to a guy that's a projected starter in Juwan Bentley. So the one last thing I would say from the linebacker group is that we saw a lot of Josh Uche off the ball, Tom. So he has been, it feels like, exclusively an edge guy recently. But they used him off the ball where he played a little bit at Michigan. So that's interesting to me because he's a really good athlete and he's somebody who could track sideline to sideline. But clearly they're not using him only on the edge. He did both on Monday.
A ton of running and conditioning at the end for the entire team. I mean, it went on and on and on. So clearly the Patriots are of a mind that nobody's going to outwork them during these OTAs. Isn't that right, Phil?
Yeah,
I think you surprised how much they ran.
I was a little bit. When we see them do their conditioning, usually it's on the hills, and what we saw on Monday makes me feel like that was even a little bit harder, even though they were just on the practice field, and they were basically doing 50-yard sprints. It felt like, or suicides. If you played basketball growing up, you run about 50 yards up and come about 50 back, and then you might get a little bit of a break. But they had half the team on one practice field and half the team on the other, and there were not a lot of breaks because it wasn't like when they go on the hills, there's a long line. You run your hill sprint and then you come back, and you might wait a minute before you go back. There wasn't a whole lot of waiting because they had the whole team running at once. So that to me is what made it look pretty grueling. And it just reminded me of, and I know you remember this story too, in 2014 when I think it was LaFell who maybe told us
LaFell and
this.
Revis.
Yeah, they're leaving the facility one day, probably around this time of year. They said, "Man, we better win this freaking thing if this is how hard we're going to be working at this time of year." And obviously they did in 2014, but those kinds of workouts I think are wake up calls for guys, veteran guys that haven't been here before, for sure.
Yeah. Hey, I want to close the pod today with an email review that we got. Appreciate our guy sending this in, CCE. But he said, Tom, I just listened to your latest podcast with Eric Scalavino. I appreciate the fact that you're at least listening to feedback about what some of us fans and consumers believe is an overflow of negativity from the media. But what I would like to share is that opinions, good and bad, are expected from the media. However, the, quote, overzealous, speculative negativity, end quote, and damning of decisions before a result is even possible is what grates many of us. Maybe we are headed to a dumpster fire this year. The media has warned us. So time to move on and find other stories. You guys will be proven right or wrong soon enough about this chapter of Bill Belichick's Patriots. Although I'm just a lifelong fan that truly hopes you're wrong about the coaching-related threats to Max development in the incoming season, I'm objective enough to accept that it could go sideways. And if it does, we are in for some ugly times. I just want the season to play out, and in the interim, get as much Patriots news as I can. And your podcast has been doing that for me since I discovered it while living in Tokyo and trying to learn how to drive on the wrong side of the road. Thanks for keeping me company. Stay well. So good feedback. Appreciate you. We hear you, and we will share.
Note.
Yeah, good note. And we take it with you take it to heart. Phil, great stuff. No pod Thursday. Nose is out of town. No pod Thursday. Nose out of town. See ya.